Elise Jefferson, a decorated Navy SEAL who walked into a courthouse in Birmingham, Alabama, not as a soldier, but as a citizen standing up for justice. What should have been a quiet legal proceeding turned explosive when a veteran cop, Rick Halston, attacked her in full view of the court, unaware of who she really was. That one brutal kick didn't just knock a woman down, it cracked open a hidden system of abuse, corruption, and silence that stretched from patrol cars to political offices. In the aftermath, Elise didn't seek revenge. She exposed a machine and rewrote the rules. But how does one woman bring an entire system to its knees? And what does it take to make change last after the headlines fade? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to share where you're watching from. Subscribe to our channel to ensure you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. The courtroom was thick with silence, not the ordinary kind that settled before a judge entered, but the loaded kind, the kind that hums with suspicion, tension, and unspoken judgment. Elise Jefferson stood in the aisle, hands loosely clasped, her suit clean-cut and understated, her expression unreadable. She was the kind of woman who didn't need to assert authority to command a room. Her presence did that for her. Shoulders square, posture aligned, steps calculated, purposeful. But not everyone in that courtroom saw composure. Some saw a threat. The uniformed officer across the room certainly did. Officer Rick Halston narrowed his eyes the moment Elise entered. He didn't recognize her face, but something about her unsettled him. It wasn't loud. It wasn't defiant. It was the fact that she looked like she knew exactly what she was doing, like she wasn't afraid. And for men like Halston, that was enough to raise alarm. A black woman walking into a courtroom with confidence? It didn't sit right with him, especially when she handed over a government-issued ID that labeled her a former Navy SEAL. The ID should have ended the exchange. It had all the right symbols: military clearance, service designation, federal validation. But Rick didn't even look at it properly. He glanced at the card, then back at Elise's face. What he saw wasn't rank or respect. He saw audacity. The audacity of a woman who didn't flinch, didn't apologize, didn't lower her eyes. That was all it took. "You think you belong here," Rick barked, loud enough to silence the last whisper in the courtroom. Elise didn't answer at first. She was used to being misunderstood, underestimated. She had endured interrogations overseas more intense than this, had stood unblinking in rooms full of people who doubted her. This, she told herself, was just another kind of battlefield. Calmly, she responded, "I've shown you my ID, officer. I'm a witness in this case." Rick's jaw tightened. His hand hovered too long near his holster. His boots creaked on the polished floor as he stepped closer. Before Elise could move, speak, or shift her stance, he launched forward and drove his knee into her abdomen. The impact stole her breath. The room erupted. A woman screamed. Papers fluttered to the ground. The judge shouted for order, voice cracking over the rising chaos. Elise hit the ground hard, shoulder grazing the wooden bench, eyes watering not from pain but fury. But she didn't fight back. She didn't throw a punch or pull a move from her tactical training, though she could have dropped Halston in less than 3 seconds. Instead, she rose, slowly, methodically, the kind of rise that silences a room without a single word. She brushed off her suit, adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, and locked eyes with the officer who had just assaulted her in front of a full courtroom. Her voice was low but sharp enough to slice through the tension like a blade. "You have no idea who I am." And he didn't. He didn't know that Elise Jefferson had spent 12 years in the Navy, 9 of those embedded in counterterrorism units, 5 of those on the most classified tactical team in the Pacific. He didn't know she had led successful recovery operations in regions so dangerous most civilians didn't even know they existed. He didn't know that she had trained foreign forces in hostile terrain, survived ambushes, interrogations, and once talked down a hostage-taker with nothing but her eyes and her words. He didn't know she'd seen what real lawlessness looked like, and that what she'd just experienced in an American courtroom wasn't far off. And more importantly, he didn't know that the woman he just attacked had connections. Not just rank-and-file military connections, strategic ones. political ones. People in D.C. who picked up when she called. People who owed her favors. People who had seen her lead teams into burning zones and come out alive. People who knew exactly what she stood for. But none of that mattered to Rick Halston in that moment. All he saw was a woman, black, poised, unafraid, challenging his authority just by existing in a space he didn't believe she belonged in. And in the seconds after his attack, as the room struggled to understand what had just happened, he still didn't fully register the mistake he'd made. It wouldn't be until the footage went viral, until the headlines exploded, until the badge on his chest began to feel less like a shield and more like a target, because someone in the room had recorded it. Not one, but 3 phones. One was already uploading to a private network, another was live streaming, the third belonged to someone Rick would have never suspected, Detective Aaron Wallace, seated in the far corner under the guise of court security, but in truth operating under entirely different orders. Orders that had very little to do with court protocol and everything to do with watching Rick. The image of Elise Jefferson taking a knee to the gut while holding a military ID would be replayed on every major news network within hours. Her name would trend, her record would surface, and so would Rick's. But Elise wasn't concerned about headlines. Her mind had already moved past the pain, the outrage, the courtroom gasps. She had shifted into tactical mode, and the first step in any counter-operation was understanding the enemy. Rick Halston wasn't just a rogue cop. She could feel it in her bones. His aggression wasn't impulsive. It was practiced, and if this courtroom allowed it to happen so easily, she knew the rot ran deeper, much deeper. But this wasn't where the story began. What happened in that courtroom was not the beginning, it was the spark. The beginning came 2 days earlier, with a confidential assignment Rick had received under the radar. A memo marked unofficial, a name scribbled hastily, Elise Jefferson, a suspicious traveler, former military, connected to a current investigation, target for surveillance. And that's where the real story started. 48 hours before the courtroom incident, Officer Rick Halston sat in the back office of the precinct, flipping through a slim manila folder. Inside were just 2 sheets of paper. No photos, no substantial evidence, just a flagged name, Elise Jefferson, and a vague description that read, possible tech transfer operative, frequent interstate travel, military background, subject maintains low public profile. The order wasn't stamped. There was no departmental header, just a scribbled note at the top. Monitor and intercept if necessary. Discretion advised. It wasn't protocol. It was personal. And Rick knew exactly what that meant. He'd received this kind of off-the-books assignment before. Someone up the chain wanted Elise watched, maybe even neutralized, but didn't want to be connected to the outcome. These ghost directives never came with clarity, but they always came with implications. And Rick, who had built his entire career on turning gut feelings into arrests, didn't need much more. He looked at the name again. A black woman, ex-military, bouncing between states, rarely staying in one place for long. She used military transport services, sometimes drove rental cars registered under temporary IDs, always carried a federal card. That in itself wasn't criminal. But Rick didn't need criminal behavior to be convinced of someone's guilt. What concerned him, what always concerned him, was behavior that made sense to no one but the person doing it. Independence. Silence, confidence. Those were the kinds of things that raised alarms in his head, especially when they came from someone who looked like Elise. Rick opened his laptop and ran a quick trace on the last few locations attached to her ID usage. Charlotte, Savannah, Nashville. Nothing connected, no pattern, just clean surgical movements across the South. He muttered under his breath, wondering what kind of regular civilian had the need to move like that. He cross-referenced her last known destination, Birmingham. Court appearance logged under her name, not as a defendant but as a civilian witness. That caught him off guard. Most of the people on Rick's radar weren't there to help anyone. But the directive didn't care about intent. It cared about presence. Elise Jefferson was in Birmingham, and Rick was already behind schedule in getting eyes on her. He closed the folder and walked out of the office without checking in. No one questioned him. Rick had built a reputation as a man who followed orders without asking where they came from. The kind of officer who didn't flinch when the system handed him gray areas to operate in. As long as the outcome was clean, an arrest, a disruption, a dismissal, nobody cared about the trail of bruises or the gaps in reports. That was the currency Rick dealt in. Fear, ambiguity, authority untethered from oversight. He drove toward the courthouse slowly, watching for the black government-style sedans he knew Elise favored. He didn't know what she looked like, but he imagined someone built like a soldier, walking with clipped steps, face unreadable, demeanor distant. He would know her when he saw her, and when he did, he wouldn't wait. He'd follow, observe, provoke if necessary. Because if there was one thing Rick believed above all, it was that anyone hiding something would eventually give themselves away, especially when the pressure was dialed high enough. Back at the precinct, he had left the unofficial file sitting out on his desk. Not intentionally, he didn't worry about people snooping. Most of them were too busy clearing low-level drug busts and chasing shoplifters to pay attention to something without a case number. The few who did notice it wouldn't ask. In a culture built around silence, no one dared question an order that smelled even faintly of higher authority. What Rick didn't know, however, was that someone had seen the folder. Detective Aaron Wallace, who had been working under the guise of a data analyst for internal affairs, had caught a glimpse of it during a late-night shift. Aaron knew the language. Monitor and intercept was code, a license to apply pressure without justification. It was exactly the kind of directive that had led to multiple civil rights complaints against the department, cases that never made it past internal review boards because the paper trail conveniently disappeared. But Aaron had started his own file, a quiet one, offline. He didn't report it. He didn't raise alarms. He waited. He watched. And Rick, as expected, did. Meanwhile, Elise was halfway across state lines, unaware of the surveillance forming behind her. She was focused on something entirely different. Her cousin, Dion Carter, a 21-year-old senior at a state university who had been arrested during a so-called routine stop and frisk. The police claimed he fit the description of a suspect involved in a recent string of convenience store robberies. No weapon was found, no stolen goods, just Dion slammed against a patrol car, his phone confiscated, his laptop bag searched without a warrant, and a pair of handcuffs slapped on as bystanders recorded with wide eyes but said nothing. The charges had been vague: suspicious behavior, refusal to comply, possible obstruction. Elise had seen enough of those kinds of charges in her life to know what they really meant. He talked back, or worse, stood still and expected dignity. She hadn't spoken to Dion in months, not out of distance, but because military life had trained her to compartmentalize. But when she got the call from his mother, her aunt, she hadn't hesitated. She canceled a planned trip to Virginia, rerouted everything, packed only what she needed to validate her credentials in court, and drove south. She didn't come in uniform. She didn't want the SEAL badge to speak louder than her words. But she did come prepared. Elise had seen enough inside war rooms and beyond enemy lines to know that courtrooms were just another kind of battlefield. The bullets were different, but the damage was the same, and she had no intention of watching her cousin become another casualty of silence. As she neared Birmingham, she rehearsed her statement in her head. She wouldn't dramatize anything. She didn't need to. She had the documents. She had the receipts. Her only task was to speak the truth, and to be ready when the truth alone wasn't enough. What she didn't know yet was that her name had already been whispered into the wrong circles, attached to the wrong assumptions, and printed onto a file that gave one man the permission to turn suspicion into violence. Elise Jefferson stepped into the courthouse not as a visitor, not as a defendant, and not as someone unsure of their place. She stepped in as a woman who had led men through enemy territory, debriefed generals under satellite surveillance, and commanded silence in rooms where chaos ruled. Her presence was not the kind that demanded attention with noise. It was the kind that absorbed attention without trying. She wore a plain navy moose suit, pressed but not flashy, her boots polished but silent on the floor, her folder held flat against her side like a weapon holstered for use. Her face was calm, unreadable, but her eyes scanned everything: the bailiffs, the gallery, the doorways, the judge's bench, measuring, calculating. Elise didn't need to wear a uniform for people to sense her training. She didn't carry a weapon, but every movement said, "I know how to end you if I need to." That was the kind of discipline 12 years in the Navy had etched into her bones, the kind of awareness that came not from fear but from clarity. But in this courtroom, that strength didn't inspire respect. It triggered suspicion. People stiffened as she passed. A few whispered. The woman at the clerk's desk looked her up and down before asking to see her credentials again, as if the ID Elise had handed over wasn't enough. Elise didn't flinch. She repeated calmly, "I'm here as a character witness in the Carter case. My name is Elise Jefferson. My identification is valid." The clerk paused, eyes narrowing slightly, before waving her through without a word. Elise didn't respond. She'd had that same exchange 100 times in 100 different places. The only variable was whether the person behind the desk wore a uniform or a suit. As she walked into the main courtroom, she spotted her cousin Dion seated beside his public defender, shoulders tense, head bowed slightly. Elise's pace didn't change, but her eyes locked onto his. He looked up, startled at first, then relieved. He gave her a half nod, eyes wide with the kind of hope people try to hide when they're not sure they're allowed to feel it. Elise nodded once back and took her seat, quietly, in the third row. She opened her folder and began reviewing the documents: military commendations, community service records, testimonials from professors, Dion's transcript. She had organized them not to impress, but to disarm. Judges respected order. Elise didn't trust the system to work on its own. She trusted preparation to leave it no excuses. She could feel the tension the moment she entered, not just from the room, but from one man in particular. The officer near the exit doors, arms crossed, jaw clenched, eyes locked on her with the cold intensity of someone threatened by silence. Officer Rick Halston. Elise didn't know his name yet, but she knew the type. He didn't wear suspicion on his sleeve. He wore it behind his eyes. She could see it in the way he stood too stiffly, how his gaze followed her movements, how his fingers brushed the butt of his holstered sidearm every few seconds. Not as a habit, but as a message. She met his stare for a full second longer than etiquette allowed, not to provoke, just to let him know she saw him, and he hated it. Elise had seen that hatred before. Not in combat, but in the moments before it, in border checkpoints run by men who didn't know who they were dealing with, in interrogation rooms where her rank was ignored until she proved it, in airports where her name triggered double scans and her passport triggered double takes. The hostility of men like Halston wasn't about what she did, it was about what she represented. Calm control in a body they expected to shrink. She turned back to her folder, not giving him another thought. She wasn't here for him. She was here because Dion had called no one. His mother had called Elise in tears. No one believed him. No one was willing to say the charges were empty, built on nothing but an accusation from a gas station clerk who said Dion fit the description. No weapon, no security footage, no items recovered, just a hoodie, a skin tone, and a refusal to beg. Elise knew how quickly a profile became a prison. She'd seen it overseas. She'd seen it in Chicago. She'd seen it in training manuals written by men who thought they understood the streets. Dion didn't need a lawyer. He had one. He needed someone who knew how systems like this operated from the inside, how they filtered fear through law and called it order. Elise wasn't angry when she walked in. She wasn't even emotional. She was surgical. This wasn't a courtroom to her. It was a deployment zone, and Halston's stare was just another piece of terrain. She marked it, logged it, and waited, because people like him always showed their hand eventually. He wouldn't be able to help it, and when he did, Elise would already be holding the receipts. She kept her head down and her pen moving, marking the sections she'd read a dozen times before. Dion's defense was flimsy, rushed, and clearly underfunded. Elise had offered to bring a private lawyer, but Dion insisted on keeping things normal. He didn't want special treatment. Elise understood that, but normal wasn't safe. Not in this room. Not in this world. As the judge entered and called the court to order, Elise folded her hands and straightened her spine. Her eyes stayed forward, but her awareness didn't blink. And in the back of the room, Officer Halston watched her with growing discomfort, because something about her stillness terrified him. He wouldn't admit it, not even to himself. But it wasn't anger he felt. It was fear. Not of what she might do, but of what she might expose. And she hadn't even spoken yet. But that fear, unspoken, crawling just beneath the skin, was about to turn into action. Because Rick Halston wasn't just intimidated. He was afraid of what Elise represented. And fear makes men like him reckless. Rick Halston didn't become a veteran officer by following rules. He became one by bending them just enough to be praised. 2 decades in uniform, 20 years of playing the game better than most, and he'd learned one lesson above all else. Perception mattered more than paperwork. His arrest reports were always airtight. His use of force statements hit the right buzzwords: resisted, threatened, non-compliant, and even when complaints were filed, they never reached the surface. Internal reviews got buried. Witnesses became unreliable. The department liked men like Rick, men who got results. He was rewarded with plaques, citations, and late-night handshakes in rooms where strategy overrode accountability. What mattered was the numbers. How many arrests, how many seizures, how many people pulled off the streets in the name of order. And Rick delivered. No one questioned how, at least not out loud. He'd worked every beat in the city, built a network of quiet allegiance, and crafted his own unofficial policy. If someone gave you a bad feeling, you handled it early. Don't wait for a crime, anticipate one. Preemptive pressure, that was his specialty, and it worked. Because the system wasn't built to challenge instincts like his, it was built to protect them. But that morning, something rattled him. Elise Jefferson. She didn't move like the others. She didn't shift when he stared. She didn't smile to soften her presence or blink to show submission. She just looked, direct, unwavering, like she'd seen men like him before and wasn't impressed. Rick told himself it was a gut feeling, but deep down he knew better. It wasn't instinct, it was threat. Not from her actions, but from her control. She was too calm, too sharp, and she didn't explain herself. That was enough. He'd seen her credentials. Military ID, probably real, but it didn't sit right. She was too put together, too disciplined. He told himself she was hiding something. That's how he justified the tightness in his chest. That's how he rewrote fear as suspicion. Elise Jefferson didn't violate a law, she violated his sense of control, and Rick couldn't stand that. He asked around, nothing came up. No warrants, no alerts, just a clean file. Still, he flagged her. Entered her name into a system not meant for her, tagged her as possible affiliated without evidence. No one questioned it. His authority allowed it. He started showing up near her assigned courtroom more frequently. He watched her talk to the defense team, watched how no one questioned her presence. He studied her silence like it was a confession. The system had taught him to trust his feelings, and right now, every feeling screamed that this woman didn't belong. Not because of what she did, but because of how unbothered she was. That's what made Rick dangerous. He didn't need orders. He didn't need facts. He needed discomfort. That was enough to escalate, enough to act. The morning of the incident, he stood by the courtroom doors like usual, watching her arrive. She didn't flinch, just walked past, nodding once toward the bailiff and handing over her ID. Rick stepped closer, tried to get a reaction. She didn't blink, just said calmly, "I've already checked in." He hated that tone, that evenness, that refusal to acknowledge his authority as superior. He could feel the pressure building in his chest, but he masked it behind protocol. He followed her into the room, leaned near the bench, stood just inside the line of sight. Every move calculated, rehearsed. He waited waited for a moment, any excuse, to turn his gut feeling into action, and then she stood, quietly, confidently. Rick didn't remember what triggered him. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was the way she reached for her folder. Or maybe it was just the boiling certainty that no one was going to check her if he didn't. So he acted. Didn't ask, didn't warn, just moved. A step forward, one hand pushing her shoulder back, the other grabbing her wrist. She tensed, not in fear, but like someone who'd been trained for worse. Still, she didn't resist. So Rick escalated, slammed his knee into her abdomen and shoved her backward, hard. The courtroom gasped. Papers flew. Elise hit the floor, breath forced from her lungs, but expression unchanged. She looked up, not shocked, not pleading, just watching. That made it worse. Rick stood over her, breath heaving, adrenaline spiking. He was sure someone would back him, but the room was frozen. The judge, the attorneys, the gallery, no one moved. Cameras caught it all. The silence that followed wasn't confusion. It was realization. Rick had crossed a line too visibly this time, but still he stood there, waiting for someone to defend him, to justify it. No one did, and when Elise stood, slow and steady, dusted off her suit and said clearly, "You have no idea who I am," the tide turned. She didn't yell, didn't shove, just spoke. And that's when Rick felt it shift. The confidence he'd worn like armor cracked. Because this wasn't a civilian. This wasn't someone who'd backed down. He saw it in her eyes. He hadn't humiliated her. He'd triggered her. And now it was too late to walk it back. Cameras had been rolling. Witnesses had seen everything. And Rick didn't realize it yet, but that moment, that choice to act on a feeling, was about to cost him everything. His badge, his history, his illusion of control. Because Elise Jefferson was not someone who disappeared quietly. And now the system he thought protected him was about to be turned inside out. The kick landed with brutal precision. Not in a dark alley or behind a closed door, but in open court, under fluorescent lights, in front of a judge, a full jury, and an audience of silent onlookers. Officer Rick Halston didn't hesitate, didn't shout a command, didn't warn. He simply surged forward and drove his knee into the stomach of Elise Jefferson, a decorated former Navy SEAL, as she stood with her ID still visible in her outstretched hand. The sound of contact, of breath being stolen from her lungs, silenced the courtroom faster than any gavel could. Elise dropped to one knee, not from shock, but from impact, clutching the edge of the defense table to steady herself. No scream, no curse, just a sharp inhale and eyes locked like crosshairs on Rick. What followed wasn't chaos, it was paralysis. The judge's voice caught mid-sentence. A juror gasped audibly. The public defender dropped his pen. Rick stood tall, chest heaving, clearly expecting backup, justification, maybe even applause. But no one moved. No one said a word. All eyes were on Elise, still kneeling, still silent, still watching. That stare, cold and deliberate, was louder than any retaliation. It stripped Rick of all the narrative armor he thought he had. It exposed what he was, what everyone now saw. A man who struck first and thought second. Elise's lips didn't move, but the message was clear. She had endured worse than Rick Halston. She wasn't going to be broken by a coward with a badge. Slowly she rose, dusted off her suit jacket, and without turning away from Rick, said in a calm, sharp voice that carried to the back row, "You have no idea who I am." Those 8 words didn't need to be shouted. They didn't need anger to be powerful. They needed only truth. And truth, in that moment, pierced every badge, robe, and pretense in the room. Rick tried to speak, to fumble out some justification, but he knew he had gone too far. Elise didn't retaliate. She didn't need to. Because as he stood there, hand hovering over his holster, body rigid, he didn't realize the most damning piece of evidence wasn't the kick. It was the footage. The recording didn't come from a witness's phone or courtroom surveillance. It came from a discreet body cam lens. embedded inside a lapel across the aisle. Detective Aaron Wallace sat 3 rows behind the prosecution bench, arms folded, expression unreadable, but finger lightly resting against the cam's remote sync switch. Aaron wasn't just an observer, he was a plant, a long-time internal affairs officer embedded to gather data on Rick Halston and others like him. Elise had no idea. Rick certainly didn't. The department didn't even know the full scope. Aaron had been gathering footage, documents, and patterns of misconduct for 18 months. He'd seen abuses swept under policy memos, files altered quietly, witnesses pressured into silence. But nothing had been this public, this clear, this irreversible. The footage showed everything. The calm approach, the visible ID, the unprovoked strike, the stare that followed. It was evidence that required no interpretation. It was brutality captured in crystal clarity. Wallace didn't move, didn't blink. He waited exactly 3 minutes before sending the file, not to his supervisors, not to the chain of command, but to 3 separate destinations: an encrypted drive managed by a civilian oversight group, a secured military contact he'd worked with years ago, and a journalist who had once promised him, "If you ever get it on camera, I'll take it to the nation." He didn't need to press charges. He didn't need to speak. The video would do that for him. Elise didn't even know she had just become the centerpiece of something far bigger than a single courtroom assault. She adjusted her suit, turned toward the judge, and resumed her place next to her cousin's legal team. The room still hadn't found its breath. Rick shifted, glanced toward the bailiff for support, but none came. The judge finally cleared his throat, barely recovering enough composure to say, "We will take a short recess," but no one left their seats. They didn't know it yet, but the footage was already spreading. Within hours it would hit internal inboxes, then trusted journalists, and from there it would explode across news cycles, social media feeds, and public consciousness. But before any of that happened, before hashtags or headlines, one man already knew what this moment meant. Aaron Wallace sat in silence, eyes fixed on Elise, not out of pity but respect. She didn't know him. He didn't need her to. She had just changed the game without lifting a finger. Rick Halston walked backward, toward the exit, confusion building with every step. He'd done what he'd always done, used force when instinct told him to. But this time he had misread everything. This time his opponent wasn't a criminal. She was a strategist. She was the first domino. And now the line he'd crossed couldn't be erased. Not by lawyers, not by commanders, not by silence. Because the camera had been rolling, and someone was finally ready to pull the trigger on exposure. Aaron Wallace didn't waste time. The moment he walked out of that courtroom, the footage he'd captured on his covert body camera was already uploading to 3 secure locations across 3 different encrypted servers. He didn't trust anyone inside the department, not even the supervisors who had given him the original directive to monitor Officer Rick Halston. This wasn't just about one rogue cop anymore. Aaron knew the pattern. He'd studied it long enough. The same type of target, the same flimsy justification, the same silent aftermath. But this time, something had cracked. This time, the brutality wasn't hidden. It was on full display, in the heart of the courthouse, in front of a judge and jury. Elise Jefferson, the woman Rick had kicked like she was nothing, didn't need to shout or fight back. Her stare had said enough, and now Aaron had the proof that could start a fire. Elise, meanwhile, had gone quiet, not emotionally, strategically. She didn't talk to the press. She didn't go on social media. She went to the records. Elise spent the next 72 hours compiling every publicly accessible report tied to Rick Halston. But the deeper she looked, the more frustrated she became. Most of the reports were clean, too clean. Arrests with minimal detail, vague charges like obstruction, resisting, or loitering. No audio, no body cam. Some didn't even list the arresting officer's full name. The system wasn't broken, it was built this way. She knew the language, recognized the way institutions encoded violence behind bureaucracy. She started to look for the anomalies, cases where things didn't line up. She found 3. A teenager charged with resisting arrest despite having a broken arm and no priors, A middle-aged delivery driver cited for loitering outside the building he worked in. A mother booked on obstruction because she questioned why her son was being detained. All black, all in Rick's patrol zone. Elise tried to contact them. The numbers were disconnected. The addresses led nowhere. She pushed harder. She found a fourth case. A man named Harold Dinkins who had tried to file a complaint against Rick 4 years earlier. Dinkins had since left the state. Elise tracked him through a former colleague who gave her a private number. They scheduled a call. But the next morning, Elise got the news. Dinkins had been hit by a car late at night. The police called it an accident. No suspect, no camera footage, no follow-up. Elise didn't believe in coincidences. She started mapping the disappearances. Anyone who had gotten close to exposing Rick's pattern had either moved away, been injured, or simply stopped talking. It wasn't just fear, it was forced silence. Elise remembered an old phrase her CO once told her: suppression doesn't always come from bullets. Sometimes it comes from paperwork. She realized she needed access that public records couldn't give her. She needed someone who could crack into sealed files, trace deleted logs, uncover the scrubbed evidence the department buried. There was only one person she trusted with that kind of task: Marcus Shaw. Back in Kandahar, he'd run digital reconnaissance for their SEAL unit. Now he worked as a freelance cybersecurity consultant, ghosting between federal contracts and private firms, never staying in one place long enough to be tracked. She hadn't spoken to him in almost 5 years, but they didn't need small talk. Elise reached out using the same protocol they used on deployment: burner device, one-time encryption, and a phrase only they understood. Her message: need your eyes. Bigger than ops. It took less than 2 hours to get a reply. Send data. Dropped spot? She smiled. He was still operational. Elise compiled everything she had: incident numbers, officer names, arrest dates, surveillance blind spots, and loaded them onto a hardened drive. She left it in a locker at a 24-hour gym 2 counties over, just like they used to when they were stateside on silent assignments. Marcus picked it up before dawn. By nightfall, he'd already found something. Elise got the message in code. It read: 3 redacted files, 4 missing audio logs, 2 scrubbed complaints, and 1 command override. This isn't sloppy, it's systemic. Elise replied with a single phrase: trace up. She wanted the network, who ordered it, who approved it, who covered it. That night she returned to her motel room to find someone had entered. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just a moved chair, a shifted pen, a sign. She called no one. Instead, she rearranged the room to eliminate blind corners, slid a knife under the pillow, and slept in her boots. She knew how they moved. She'd been one of them once. This wasn't intimidation. This was surveillance. They were watching to see how close she'd gotten. But Elise didn't scare easily. She kept digging. Marcus sent a second package. This one included a list of every internal affairs complaint filed against Rick Halston over the past 10 years. 9 in total. Only 1 had made it to preliminary review. The others were closed, with phrases like insufficient cause, officer exonerated, complainant non-responsive. Elise recognized 2 names on that list, men who had now gone completely off-grid. One had been a school security guard, the other a warehouse worker. Elise called their employers. Both had been let go after incidents tied to arrest records. This wasn't just corruption. It was extermination of credibility. Elise realized something else. She wasn't being targeted because she was a threat. She was being monitored because she was the only one who hadn't disappeared. And that meant the clock was ticking. She needed to bring this into the light, but smart, not loud. She needed a system-wide strategy. She looked at the latest data Marcus sent. It showed internal emails, coded language between officers, and unusually high bonuses tied to Rick's arrest numbers. Elise sat back, eyes narrowed, and whispered, "They don't just disappear. They're erased." Marcus didn't need weeks, he needed hours. After years of working off-grid, bouncing between classified consulting gigs and digital security operations, He'd refined his craft to surgical precision. Once Elise dropped the hard drive and sent him access credentials, he launched into the system like it was second nature. The first thing he traced was money, because data might hide, but money always leaves a trail. What he uncovered didn't just implicate Rick Halston. It exposed a structure. Rick had been selling internal surveillance data, not to the media, not to criminal groups, but to a private security firm operating under the banner of community enhancement. That firm, Argonne Risk Solutions, specialized in predictive threat mapping. They took in data from police departments under pilot programs, then used those data streams to build proprietary risk assessments for neighborhoods, mostly black and brown communities. Rick fed them arrest records, field notes, traffic stop patterns, and complaint histories. In return, Argonne wired him quarterly consulting bonuses under a shell LLC registered to an address in Jacksonville, Florida, an address that didn't exist anymore. Marcus cross-referenced city budgets and uncovered something else. Argonne had secured over $600,000 in city funds under a line item called Community Stability and Outreach Grants. These grants, supposedly to improve public safety infrastructure, had no documented outcomes, no programs, no photos, no beneficiaries, just approvals and signatures. Elise sat across from Marcus as he laid it out on a digital whiteboard in a private server hub. Lines connected names, documents layered across each other. Rick wasn't working alone. His data streams matched periods when other officers in his unit had filed similar suspicious activity reports. 3 of them had been promoted within the last 2 years, but Rick was the blunt instrument. The others were the scalpel. Then Marcus pulled up the worst part, the names of public officials who signed off on Argonne's city contracts. Some were expected, low-level administrators, department heads, but one name stopped Elise cold. Councilwoman Bernice Lang, the same woman who had stood beside Elise at the Community Reform Conference 6 months earlier, speaking into microphones about rebuilding trust between law enforcement and marginalized community. Elise remembered vividly. Lang had wrapped an arm around her shoulder and called her a symbol of resilience. Elise's stomach twisted. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic. Lang had presented herself as a reformer while greenlighting the very program that monetized surveillance on people like Elise. The hypocrisy was infuriating, but it was also illuminating. The system didn't care who the face was, as long as the machine kept running. Elise leaned forward. "Who else?" she asked. Marcus hesitated. "You're not going to like it." He tapped the screen. A new file opened. This one was heavily redacted, but Marcus had recovered the metadata. The final authorization for one of Argonne's key surveillance extensions, timed just days before Elise's cousin's arrest, had been signed by someone unexpected, Judge Harold Vance, the same judge who had presided over Elise's courtroom hearing, the same judge who had witnessed Rick's assault and adjourned the room in silence. Elise froze, not because she was surprised, but because she had hoped, desperately, that someone in that room hadn't been complicit. She'd held out a sliver of belief that maybe the judiciary still had a line it wouldn't cross, but this proved otherwise. Vance hadn't just allowed it, he'd funded it. Marcus zoomed into the signature data. The approval had been signed under a judicial development initiative, camouflaged inside an agreement for public safety AI evaluation. It meant Rick's data transfers had been not only protected but operationalized. Elise stared at the judge's name on the screen and felt something shift in her chest. Not rage, not sadness, but something colder, resolve. She stood, paced the room, then turned to Marcus. "I need everything. Every name, every signature, every shell company." Marcus nodded. "Already compiling. But this goes deep. You pull this string, you're exposing half the city's power structure." Elise looked him in the eye. "Then we better pull it fast." Marcus didn't flinch. He knew Elise wasn't just playing defense. She was mobilizing for war. Over the next 48 hours, he worked through sleepless nights, sifting through contracts, flagging transactions, verifying signatures. Elise made a list. It included Rick, Lang, the officers promoted under his unit, the Argonne executives, and now Judge Vance. The network wasn't theoretical anymore. It was mapped, and the final piece was almost in place. Elise needed one more confirmation, something she could confront the judge with, not in secret, not in shadows, but in a legal forum. She wasn't going to blackmail him. She was going to bury him with facts. Marcus located a data folder buried inside a police procurement server. It contained biometric surveillance logs tied to the Argonne pilot program, logs that proved the department had been running facial recognition scans without public consent. The scans were primarily focused on black residents across 3 neighborhoods. One of those neighborhoods was where Elise's cousin had been arrested. She exhaled slowly, chest rising with methodical clarity. The evidence was overwhelming. The intent was undeniable, and the next move would define everything. The message came in coded language, through an old contact Elise hadn't heard from in years. A liaison from the Department of Justice wanted a quiet, respectful conversation, which in government terms usually meant a veiled threat or a polite bribe. Elise didn't flinch. She accepted the meeting but arrived early, unannounced, and positioned herself where she could see every exit. The room they placed her in was sterile, beige walls, no clock, and a table too clean to be used regularly. The man who entered wasn't a suit off the street. He was polished in a way that reeked of power. Measured steps, immaculate tie, no badge, just presence. "Ms. Jefferson," he said, offering a firm nod but no hand. "Thank you for meeting us." She offered nothing in return. He slid a folder across the table with a kind of reverence, like it contained sacred text. Inside, on the first page, was a proposed commendation, the Medal of Honor, the highest military distinction, complete with citations Elise had never seen but knew were real. Someone had combed her classified deployments with care. The second page carried a full expungement for Jamal Carter, her cousin, plus a government fund education package. Tuition, housing, stipend, all arranged. The third page held a letter drafted for public release, praising Elise's restraint during the courthouse incident and celebrating her decision to step back from conflict in the name of peace. The last page was the clincher, a non-disclosure clause so tightly worded it strangled truth itself. She read it twice, slowly. They weren't just asking her to stay quiet about Rick Halston. They were asking her to let the system reset without accountability. Elise raised an eyebrow but kept her voice steady. "You want me to sell silence for ceremony?" The man didn't blink. "We're offering closure. For you, for your cousin, for a city on edge. You don't close a wound by covering it," she replied. "You clean it, or it festers. The public doesn't want infection," he said. "They want calm. So you'll fake it," she said. "Give them a parade, not a reckoning." His smile was paper thin. "You've served your country honorably. This is a chance to serve it again by avoiding unnecessary disruption." Elise closed the folder, not angrily, but with deliberate force. "I didn't risk my life so that cowards could stay comfortable." "Comfort," he said softly, "is the only thing the powerful ever protect." She stood. "Then I'm here to take it from them." He didn't stop her. He didn't need to. She had just refused their last offer, and they would not make another. As she left the building, she felt the air shift. Eyes followed. Doors didn't open as easily. Elise walked back into daylight knowing she had chosen the harder path, but also the only one that aligned with the values she'd spent a lifetime defending. Back at her temporary apartment, she called Marcus. "They tried to buy me," she said. "So now we burn it down." "Already prepping the matches," he replied. They didn't laugh. They didn't need to. Elise spent the next 8 hours preparing a digital release schedule. Marcus encrypted layers of metadata, rerouted IP trails, and built a firewall around their evidence vault. Elise wrote personalized emails to 3 reporters she trusted, each from a different outlet, each chosen for their history of integrity. She included different segments of the evidence for each, forcing collaboration and cross-confirmation. No single leak, a synchronized explosion. Then she called Aaron Wallace. "It's time," she said. We're not warning them, we're revealing them." He agreed. The courthouse video had already primed the public, but now they'd see the structure, the money, the data, the coordination, the silence. Elise didn't sleep. At 3:00 a.m., she stood in front of her window, watching the city lights flicker, wondering how many of those buildings housed complicity behind polished floors and branded pins. She remembered the folder, the metal, the speech they had prepared for her. Elise could already see the press conference they'd wanted, flags behind her, officials flanking her, calling her a hero for stepping away. She would have been the perfect token, but Elise Jefferson was never built for decoration. She was built for deployment. Her strength wasn't in restraint, it was in knowing when to strike, and she had just declared war. She messaged Marcus one final time before dawn. "This is the line. After this, we don't get to be invisible." His reply came instantly. "Good. I was tired of hiding." As the first wave of uploads went live, Elise sat calmly and sipped black coffee. The fire had started. There would be no going back. Elise Jefferson didn't launch the truth with a press conference or a media stunt. She launched it like a covert operation. For weeks, she had worked in silence with Marcus, sifting through interviews, police transcripts, old court footage, and public records that no one ever thought would be stitched together into something cohesive. But that's what made it powerful. It wasn't one headline. It was a pattern, undeniable and interconnected. Every victim they interviewed added a thread. A father who spent 9 months in jail before the charges were dropped without apology. A teenage girl slammed to the pavement during a traffic stop. A store owner whose security camera footage mysteriously disappeared after his complaint. Elise documented them all. Their voices, tired but sharp, became files in a growing archive of pain and proof. Marcus encrypted every megabyte, buried it in servers across multiple cities, and backed up the core evidence vault in cold storage off-grid. They weren't just collecting information, they were preparing for war. Meanwhile, Aaron Wallace had begun pulling strings inside the department, quietly accessing case reviews that had long been closed and archived under insufficient evidence. He leaked select files to Elise, each one more damning than the last. They uncovered entire batches of misconduct reports never escalated past internal review, signed off by the same 3 names: Rick Halston, Lieutenant Davis, and Judge Vance. Elise didn't flinch. She organized them chronologically, then thematically, by victim, by pattern, by silence. She layered in emails, cross-referenced officers' schedules with arrest spikes, connected false search warrants to citywide surveillance. What began as a response to one courtroom assault became a data map of systemic abuse, but data alone wasn't enough. The moment came when a small news affiliate picked up a story, just a 30-second segment, featuring an out-of-context clip showing Elise being kicked in the ribs by Rick Halston in open court. No explanation, no names, just violence. The clip was raw, shaky, captured from the back of the courtroom. It went live at 5:41 p.m. By 6:03 p.m., it had over 100,000 views. By 7 o'clock, it was trending in 3 cities. By midnight, it had ignited a national conversation. Elise didn't sleep that night. She watched from the shadows as the story metastasized. Hashtags exploded across platforms. Kicked in court became a digital cry of outrage. Dozens of people began coming forward with similar stories, some with video, some with just memory. Elise compiled them all. She didn't give interviews. She didn't explain. She let the silence breathe, knowing the power of what was coming next. At dawn, she sent Marcus the signal. He triggered Phase 1, a slow, deliberate release of anonymized testimonies matched with redacted arrest reports. Each post was time-stamped, verified, and cross-hectored by multiple outlets, who were now begging for access. Aaron Wallace had secured enough internal documentation to validate the timelines, including 2 memos from within the department, flagging Rick's behavior but noting chain of command sensitivity. By mid-afternoon, a second wave of videos was scheduled. Elise sat with headphones on, reviewing each edit, making sure no one's story was exploited. They weren't clickbait, they were warning shots. And people listened. Activists picked them up. Legal scholars debated them. Former officers, long silenced by fear or pensions, quietly messaged Elise in support. One of them, now retired, sent her a handwritten note. "We all knew. We just never thought anyone would show the world." Elise didn't pause. She was already preparing Phase 2. It would include financial trails, emails connecting Rick's precinct to a private contractor running predictive policing software, and the key: judicial sign-offs pushed through by Judge Vance despite missing affidavits. It wasn't just corruption, it was machinery, and it was humming with efficiency. Until now. Elise and Marcus uploaded the first full report at 6:00 p.m. sharp, a dossier titled Pattern of Force. It wasn't anonymous. It bore her name, her photo, her rank. She signed the letter at the front. "To those who still believe in justice, here is what silence protected." The release sent shockwaves. Newsrooms scrambled. Politicians fumbled with statements. Civil rights groups issued immediate calls for inquiry. The DOJ, now backed into a corner, issued a curt release stating the matter was under internal review. Elise smiled. She had expected that. She didn't need their permission to continue. The goal had never been to convince the powerful. It had been to inform the people, and now they were armed with facts, footage, and fury. As the servers groaned under the strain of downloads, Elise stood by the window of Marcus's safe house and whispered to herself what her father used to say before every deployment. "No one remembers the quiet soldier until the ground starts shaking." And now it was shaking. The courtroom was packed, every seat occupied, every hallway outside lined with reporters, legal observers, and ordinary citizens drawn in by the viral footage and the promise of long-overdue accountability. Elise Jefferson walked in, not in uniform, not in dress blues or medals, but in a simple navy suit. No makeup, no flourish, just focus. The atmosphere was tense, not with hostility but with anticipation, the kind that precedes something irreversible. At the defense table, Rick Halston sat stiffly, his jaw tight, the creases in his suit unable to mask the sweat collecting around his collar. He didn't meet her gaze. Elise didn't look for it either. She didn't need validation from the man who had tried to reduce her to a stereotype with a boot. Today wasn't about Rick. It was about every name, every face, every invisible line in the paper trail that led to this moment. When she was called to testify, she walked to the stand like she had walked through war zones, measured, calculated, unwavering. The oath was routine. What followed was not. Elise began with a timeline, not of her own assault, but of systemic failure. She presented a sequence of arrest reports flagged as irregular, all signed off by. She showed inconsistencies in the body cam logs, gaps in footage that coincided with spikes in complaints. Then came the testimonies. One by one, statements from people who had vanished from the public eye re-emerged, transcribed, verified, and projected on the courtroom screen. A mother describing her son's wrongful arrest. A teacher recounting the day her student was slammed against a patrol car for questioning a search. Elise gave voice to each one, never raising her own. She didn't need to. The words spoke for themselves. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of her narration. Then came the videos. Some grainy, some crystal clear, each one time-stamped and linked to reports filed or never filed. One showed Rick searching a young man's car without probable cause. Another caught him muttering racial slurs under his breath after an arrest. Faces in the courtroom shifted. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. Next came the financials. Elise outlined the routing of discretionary funds from community safety initiatives into contracts with a private security firm called Grayfield Solutions, the same company Rick's name was linked to through payment trails. Marcus had traced the money through 4 shell companies. The result was clear. Taxpayer money rerouted to reward arrests, regardless of merit. Elise didn't accuse, She presented a simple set of facts one after another, stacking like bricks until the weight of them filled the room. Then she showed the internal memos, communications between Rick and Lieutenant Davis using coded language to describe matching profile. Words like shadow watch and confirm pattern appeared repeatedly in contexts that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. Elise concluded her testimony with a direct address. "I was not the first," she said, her voice steady, "and I will not be the last unless this room decides that silence is no longer the default response to violence in uniform." She stepped down from the stand, returning to her seat without glancing at Rick. The prosecutor stood, his expression unreadable, and called Rick to the stand. His attorney objected, but the judge overruled. Rick took the oath, his voice slightly unsteady. When questioned about specific incidents, he defaulted to policy speak. "Standard procedure," he said. "Perceived threat. Probable cause." Elise didn't flinch, but the courtroom did. When asked about the arrest quotas and incentives, he claimed ignorance. When shown the memo bearing his initials authorizing additional surveillance in minority neighborhoods, he said it must have been misfiled. The prosecutor pressed harder. "Officer Halston, can you tell us why you approached Ms. Jefferson that day in court?" Rick hesitated. "She matched a profile." "What profile?" "Suspicious behavior." "What behavior was suspicious?" "She was unresponsive. She ignored protocol. She showed you identification, did she not?" "Yes, but..." "So, which part of her presence indicated criminal behavior?" Rick paused, his throat dry. "She just didn't look like she belonged there." The courtroom went still. The judge adjusted his glasses. The prosecutor nodded slowly. "You mean she didn't look like someone who had a right to wear that uniform?" Rick didn't answer. "Let me ask it differently," the prosecutor continued. "What exactly did Ms. Jefferson match? Because her record, her clearance, her service history, none of it suggests she belonged anywhere but right where she stood." Rick looked down, defeated. The damage was done. But Elise had one more play. She stood again, requesting permission to address the court. The judge hesitated, then nodded. She turned toward Rick and spoke directly, her voice lower now, personal. "You asked yourself why I looked familiar?" she said. "You couldn't place it. Not in the system, not in the suspects. But maybe it's because I've stood in front of men like you before, on different soil, under different flags, men who thought silence meant weakness, who mistook discipline for permission. You weren't looking at a threat, Rick. You were looking at the reflection of everything this badge was supposed to protect, and couldn't." She paused. "And the only thing that made me suspicious to you was my existence." The room didn't clap. It didn't cheer. It breathed, like it had been waiting for someone to say what no one else would. Elise nodded once and returned to her seat. The judge announced a recess. Outside, the crowd was swelling. Inside, the foundation had shifted. Elise didn't return to the courtroom stand with rage or noise. She moved quietly, her steps deliberate, carrying a single sealed envelope in one hand. There was no folder, no briefcase, no backup documents, just that one envelope. The judge permitted her to speak again after a quick exchange with the prosecutor. This wasn't scripted, this wasn't in anyone's plan, but she had requested 5 minutes, and 5 minutes was all she needed. Elise turned toward the judge, the jury, and the press now occupying the last row of seats, cameras low but ready. Her voice was steady and precise. She explained that in her previous testimony she had described Rick Halston's misconduct and abuse of power. What she hadn't revealed then was the structural incentive behind his actions. She held up the envelope and stated, "What I am about to show you is not just the story of 3 officers gone rogue. It is a blueprint of how data was weaponized against American citizens and sold to the highest bidder." She opened the envelope and unfolded several pages, each marked with internal stamps and metadata. The courtroom screen lit up as the documents were projected. Elise narrated the timeline. It started with innocent-looking data, demographic profiles, police stop records, surveillance footage tagged with facial recognition metadata. The data wasn't destroyed or securely stored, it was sold. To whom? A private defense contractor operating under the name Lockridge Tactical Systems. The contractor had signed an agreement with the city 2 years earlier to advise on urban safety architecture. The vague language covered what was essentially data mining, profiling individuals flagged as statistically high risk, based on factors like zip code, prior contact with police, and frequency of neighborhood patrols. Elise detailed how Rick and 2 other officers had facilitated this data transfer through encrypted drives. In exchange, they received off-the-book compensation routed through a fake community grant initiative called the Safe Blocks Project. The money was disguised as incentive bonuses for community engagement, but was in fact part of a profit-sharing mechanism between city enforcers and private defense contractors. The room tensed as Elise named the other 2 officers, both still serving, both previously cleared in unrelated misconduct reviews. But the true explosion came when she revealed the next name, Councilman Raymond Archer. She clicked to the next slide, displaying a scanned approval memo bearing Archer's signature, authorizing the transfer of oversight funds to Safe Blocks. He had been one of the most vocal supporters of police reform in the public sphere. He had appeared on news panels, spoken at community vigils, and even stood beside Elise just a week prior during a televised event, praising her courage. His presence was a mask. Behind the scenes, he had co-signed a network that commodified Black lives and sold predictive threat assessments to federal contractors. Gasps filled the courtroom. A few jurors leaned forward, expressions stunned. The judge asked for order, tapping the gavel twice. Elise didn't flinch. She kept going. She laid out the flow of money, showing how the Safe Blocks grant received funds from a federal Homeland Security initiative, which were then funneled through a shell nonprofit registered in Delaware. From there, the money split. One path to the company, another directly to the officers, and a third to undisclosed community liaisons, one of whom was Councilman Archer's former campaign manager. Elise had built the chain. Marcus had verified the accounts. Heron had confirmed the personnel. Then came the audio clip. Elise played it directly from a secured drive, routed through the courtroom speaker system. It was a recorded conversation between Rick Halston and one of the unnamed officers. Their voices were unmistakable. "We just flag the ones they want," Rick said in the clip. "The company takes it from there. They pay double for faces with history even if it's just a citation. Doesn't matter, they want the metrics to look right." Laughter followed. Then the other officer replied, "It's like fishing with dynamite. The city pays us to clean the block, the feds pay us to predict who might mess it up, and Safe Blocks pays us to make it look like a success story." The courtroom was dead silent. The sound had been low quality, but the meaning was crystal clear. This wasn't policing. This was a monetized surveillance pipeline, and the bait was skin color and zip code. Elise let the silence hold for 10 seconds before she spoke again. Every person profiled, every home flagged, every patrol rerouted. It all happened because someone, somewhere, decided that data is more valuable than dignity. Her voice didn't shake, it didn't rise, it landed like stone. Then came the final blow. Elise revealed that the judge presiding over her assault hearing had been listed as an unpaid consultant to the very same nonprofit that laundered the Safe Blocks money. She didn't accuse him of direct involvement, but presented the ethics disclosure form that he had failed to submit during his appointment. The judge froze. He stared at the document, then at Elise, then back at the projection. His jaw moved but produced no sound. The defense attorney tried to object. The prosecutor said nothing. The judge quietly called a 10-minute recess. Outside, news reporters were already running to broadcast vans. Inside, whispers turned to murmurs, and murmurs to voices. Elise sat back down. She had said everything she needed to say. Not one lie, not one assumption. All data, all truth. All weaponized the way it was supposed to be. Not for war, but for justice. Marcus had been working through the night, eyes red from the screen's glare, sifting through digital trails, emails buried under encryption, financial ledgers disguised as development funding. He wasn't just looking for names anymore. He was tracing intent, motive, structure. Every click brought him closer to the source, and sometime around 3:47 a.m., he found it. A signature. Not Rick Halston's. Not even Councilman Archer's. It was higher than that, older, more careful. Raymond Cole. The name didn't immediately register for Marcus. He was military, not local. But Elise would know. He flagged the file, cross-referenced it, and within minutes had an entire subfolder filling with records linking Raymond Cole to the entire Safe Blocks scheme. Authorization memos, committee approvals, lobbyist emails, private contractor dinners. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became. Cole hadn't just approved funding. He had created the pathway. This wasn't about political negligence. This was architecture. When Elise saw the name, she didn't speak for several seconds. Raymond Cole had known her father, had visited her home when she was a child. He had once written her a letter of recommendation to the Naval Academy. She remembered thinking he spoke like a preacher but smiled like a dealer. It made sense now. He hadn't changed. He'd just gotten better at hiding the rot. Elise didn't waste time. She sat down, opened her notebook, and began outlining her next move. This wasn't just about Rick anymore. It wasn't even about the officers who facilitated the system. This was about the design. Someone had built the engine. Someone had kept it running while the public argued about smoke. Elise had no intention of letting that person walk out the back door untouched. She called Aaron. She called Marcus. Then she called 2 local journalists who had stayed quiet until now, waiting to see if Elise's case would crumble or hold. "I'm not leaking a story," she said plainly. "I'm offering you a seat at the front of a structure collapse." She scheduled a press conference for the following Monday, gave no details about content, and told the team to prepare for pushback. And it came fast. That afternoon, her car was followed by an unmarked black SUV. The following morning, her email accounts were locked out. Marcus had to re-secure her server and build her a new encrypted line. Even the venue she booked for the press conference received a last-minute cancellation, warning from a city zoning issue that didn't exist. None of it stopped her. Elise didn't flinch. She told the team they'd hold the press conference outside if they had to, on concrete with no mic. Let the wind carry the truth. Meanwhile, Raymond Cole, unaware of what was coming, continued his rounds. He gave a speech at a university about restoring public trust in law enforcement. He posed for a photograph with the widow of a fallen officer. He even tweeted support for the very protest movement Elise had ignited. He had no idea the storm he funded was about to spin back on him. The night before the press conference, Elise visited her father's grave. She stood in silence, arms crossed, wind brushing against the military ribbons on her jacket. "You always said politics wasn't about right or left," she murmured. "It was about pressure and who bends first." She placed her hand on the headstone, nodded once, and turned to leave. No speeches, no tears. The next morning, she stood behind a plain podium in front of a nondescript civic hall. Cameras were already rolling. The press had come. So had protesters. So had 3 officers from Internal Affairs and a quiet man from the Department of Justice, who said nothing but stood close enough to be noticed. Elise opened with a single sentence. "This is not about a man who kicked me. It's about the machine that told him to." Then she began. She laid out the full structure: safe blocks, the false grants, the data laundering, the targeted surveillance, the partnerships with federal contractors, and most importantly, the approvals. Slide by slide, she unveiled Raymond Cole's fingerprints. Emails marked urgent with his name in the approval line. Recordings of meetings where his staff discussed messaging tactics in case the funding model was challenged. A dinner receipt from 2 years ago, showing Cole and the CEO of Lockridge Tactical Systems in a private dining room with a bottle of scotch that cost more than most people's rent. She didn't attack Cole's character. She attacked his design. "We are taught to chase the trigger man," she said. But systems don't need a trigger. They need silence. And Cole gave it willingly. There was no room for interpretation. She read a segment from a signed agreement in which Cole's office waived independent audit rights for the Safe Blocks grant. That's not bureaucracy, she added. That's strategy. Reporters were scribbling furiously. A few stood up to take photos of the slides directly. Cole's office released a statement mid-conference calling the allegations a distortion of political process and budgetary complexity. Elise didn't respond. She ended her statement with a photo. It was taken 12 years ago. A young Elise, in uniform, standing beside Raymond Cole at a veterans event. He had his arm around her shoulder. She stared straight at the camera. He smiled wide. "I was proud to be in this photo," she said, "but I will not let it define what I now know. This man was never in it for justice. He was in it for control." She stepped away from the podium. No Q&A. No dramatic music. Just truth left hanging in the air. Elise Jefferson stood at the podium in front of a wall of cameras, microphones, and reporters whose expressions flickered between curiosity, doubt, and tension. She didn't wear her uniform, nor any medals or honors. Just a plain gray suit, crisp and simple, with no insignia, nothing to distract from her words. Behind her, a screen waited in standby mode. The room was hot with anticipation. The press corps hushed in rare silence. Elise didn't begin with her credentials or retell the courtroom assault. She didn't invoke Rick Halston's name or the Navy SEAL title that once protected her in foreign combat zones. Instead, she opened with a list. Names, one by one. A young man pulled over and beaten during a routine traffic stop. A woman misidentified and jailed for a crime she never committed. A student arrested on campus because he matched a vague description. Elise read them without embellishment. Age, location, charge, outcome. Most walked free, some didn't. One died by suicide, one remains missing. The names were not anecdotes, they were the beginning of an argument. "This," she said into the microphone, her voice firm, controlled, "is what happens when power stops being questioned, when systems no longer require accountability, when racism isn't punished, it's funded." The screen behind her flickered to life, and the first slide showed a flowchart. Marcus had helped her build it, meticulously mapping every link in the structure. It started with data collected by police units. Names, faces, surveillance logs. That data was funneled into systems sold to private companies. Those companies paid for access, passed it through analytics networks, and then billed city contracts under vague labels like community insight or predictive safety. Elise pointed. "This is how a traffic stop becomes a transaction. This is how your neighborhood becomes a product." Next slide. Emails between Rick Halston and a security consultant with ties to military contractors. "Here," she continued, "is where Officer Halston shares internal data. Civilian addresses. Arrest histories without warrants, without oversight. Then came the funding records. Pages of financial transfers from a shell organization labeled Urban Safety Initiative, Inc., traced back to government grants intended for youth centers and outreach. These funds were diverted, not stolen, not embezzled. Diverted with paperwork signed off by this man. The screen shifted to the face of Councilman Raymond Cole, who until last week was praised for his commitment to reform. Elise paused. The room held its breath. This man was my father's friend. He gave speeches about justice while authorizing budgets that erased people like me from databases with one unchecked box. She clicked again. This is not one case. This is the blueprint. She stepped to the side as the slide shifted again. A map. Red outlines showing where most arrests flagged as high risk occurred. 93% of these zones are majority black. More silence. Rick didn't act alone. He didn't have to. The system allowed it, encouraged it, protected it, and the moment it was exposed, it tried to offer me silence in return for medals. She met the gaze of the front row, where senior officials sat tense, some frowning, others refusing eye contact. "I don't want a medal. I want accountability." The final slide was a quote in plain text. Rick didn't create this system. The system created him. No photos, no sound, just black letters on white. Elise turned back to the microphone. Let's stop pretending this is about a rogue officer, or one moment in a courtroom. The punch didn't happen in a vacuum. That kick, that silence in the courtroom afterward, the cold eyes of a judge who said nothing, that's the culture, that's the machinery. And if you're part of that, then you don't get to be neutral anymore. Reporters erupted with questions as soon as she finished. Miss Jefferson, what do you expect the city to do next? Are you accusing elected officials of conspiracy? Do you believe this goes beyond Birmingham? Elise didn't answer. She stepped away from the podium and left the building through a side hallway. She'd said what needed to be said. Now the weight shifted to them. Within an hour, national outlets replayed her speech on loop. The quote about the system went viral. Her name became a trending topic. Social media split along its usual battle lines. To some, she was a patriot. To others, a threat. But while public opinion boiled, government offices scrambled. The mayor issued a statement vowing an immediate review. The police chief was placed on temporary leave. Rick Halston was formally arrested that afternoon and charged with assault, obstruction, evidence tampering, and civil rights violations. Elise didn't celebrate. She knew better than to confuse damage control with justice. The arrest was symbolic. The structure was still intact. That night, she met with Marcus and Aaron in a secure location. They reviewed files, organized testimony, prepared for depositions. The war wasn't over. The exposure phase was complete. What came next would be harder. Holding the architecture accountable. Elise returned home. Her apartment was dark. She poured water, sat at her desk, and opened her father's journal. He had once written, "Truth delayed is justice denied. Truth denied is democracy undone." She traced the line with her finger, then closed the journal and picked up her phone. There were 89 missed calls, 213 unread texts, and 4 media requests from major networks. She ignored them all. Then she opened a new document on her laptop and typed the title, Phase 2. At the bottom of the screen, she added one line, "Justice doesn't end with arrest. It ends with reform." Rick Halston was convicted in a swift and decisive federal trial. The evidence presented against him was overwhelming. Assault in a courtroom, unauthorized data transfers, participation in illegal surveillance, and a documented history of racial profiling, masked behind departmental protection. He was sentenced to 17 years without parole. His uniform stripped, pension revoked, badge rescinded. As he was led out in cuffs, his eyes were hollow, no longer burning with authority, but clouded with disbelief that he, the once untouchable enforcer, had been left to face it alone. The courtroom was filled with victims' families, civil rights advocates, and national press, but in the very front row, the seat meant for Councilman Raymond Cole remained empty. Cole was never called to testify, he was never indicted, he was never even officially investigated. Despite his signature on contracts, authorizations for funding, and connections to every node of the system Elise had exposed, the final decision from the Justice Department was clear. Insufficient evidence of intent. That phrase, insufficient evidence of intent, echoed like a mockery through every community meeting and public hearing that followed. Elise watched the coverage from her apartment, silent, her face unreadable. She had anticipated it. She knew how systems self-protect. Cole gave a speech 2 days later, standing before cameras, applauding the city's bravery for confronting corruption. He praised Elise for her service and integrity, and promised transparent collaboration moving forward. It was a performance wrapped in legal immunity, and it worked. The headlines pivoted. One man jailed, system healing, justice delivered. Elise turned off her television. She didn't respond to interview requests. She didn't answer her phone. She quietly left the public stage. But she didn't vanish. Instead, she returned to her father's house in Richmond, the same 2-story home where she'd grown up, where the air still smelled of cedar wood and memory. Her father had died long before any courtroom scandal, gunned down in a traffic stop by a police officer who mistook his briefcase for a weapon. The officer walked free. Her mother had never spoken much after that. Elise found his old study untouched. dust gathering on legal pads, books on civil procedure, and an unfinished manuscript titled, "When the Law Fears the Truth." She opened it slowly. His handwriting was careful, deliberate, every sentence carved like stone. But the manuscript stopped halfway through a chapter titled, "The Cost of Silence." For weeks, Elise didn't leave the house. She read, she wrote, she stayed up late at the dining table with papers spread around her like battlefield maps. The media called it a retreat. Headlines speculated about her mental health, her next move, whether she'd run for office. But Elise was not retreating. She was retracing, reclaiming, rebuilding. She wasn't interested in a press tour or a seat in some committee arranged by the same people who had once closed doors in her face. She wanted something else, something lasting, a record that couldn't be manipulated by spin doctors or drowned out by trending cycles, a foundation for those who would come after her, who would face their own Rick Halstons and Raymond Coles. She rewrote her father's manuscript from scratch. She kept the title, but she told the story through her own lens. How silence isn't always absence. How survival is not the same as justice. How power adapts even when it is exposed. She wrote in the mornings and again late at night. She avoided phone calls but answered letters, dozens of them. Handwritten, some from veterans, others from mothers, students, even retired officers. They weren't fan mail. They were confessions, testimonies, some painful, some hopeful. Elise included a few, anonymized, in her book. She dedicated it to her father and to every child who learned too early how to say, "Yes, officer," with fear instead of respect. When she finished the final draft, she printed it herself. No agent, no publisher. She didn't want it sold or marketed. She sent it out freely to schools, libraries, advocacy centers, community programs. "Knowledge is a public right," she wrote in the introduction. And truth doesn't need permission. By the end of the month, the book had been downloaded over 200,000 times. Professors began assigning chapters. Grassroots leaders quoted her at city council meetings. Anonymous PDFs appeared in inboxes across the country. Someone translated it into Spanish, then Vietnamese. Elise never tried to track it. She just kept writing. Meanwhile, the system she had cracked open began to stitch itself back together. Not fully, not quietly, but predictably. New police reform committees were formed, some of them real, others symbolic. Raymond Cole stepped down 6 months later. No scandal, just retirement. His seat was filled by another familiar face. Change moved slowly, wrapped in ceremony, in policy debates, in funding cycles. Elise didn't protest. She didn't comment. Her focus had shifted. She started mentoring young activists, not publicly, not with press kits or campaigns, quietly, over coffee, over late-night calls, over strategy documents marked confidential. She taught them not just how to speak, but when to hold silence like a blade. She taught them what she had learned in deserts overseas and courtrooms back home, how to survive systems that bend the rules and rewrite history. One night, a student asked her if she regretted anything. Elise paused. "I regret how long it took me to realize the fight wasn't about me," she said. "It was never personal. It was structural. Personal is how they distract you." The student nodded, scribbled it down, then looked up. "What happens next?" Elise didn't answer. Instead, she slid a folder across the table. Inside it was a new project plan, one that had no budget, no slogan, just a clear objective: dismantle what remains. Marcus Williams was 17, honor student, valedictorian, and son of the state's highest-ranking prosecutor. His only mistake that evening was driving the black Tesla his parents had gifted him for graduation. He was cruising down a well-lit avenue near downtown when the flashing lights appeared behind him. The officer who stopped him didn't recognize his last name. He saw a young black teen in a new luxury vehicle, assumed the worst, and escalated without warning. Marcus did everything right. Hands on the wheel, clear speech, no sudden moves. But the officer called in backup, claimed suspicion of grand theft auto, and had Marcus out of the car, hands on the hood, within 5 minutes. A passerby caught the entire encounter on their phone, and within hours, the video was circulating online. Elise watched the footage from a television in a diner on the edge of town. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She exhaled, calm and cold. "Here we go again," she muttered. But this time was different, because this time she wasn't alone in knowing how to fight. As the story broke, reactions poured in. It wasn't just about Marcus being arrested. It was about who he was. David Williams, his father, was not a man who stayed silent. Within 30 minutes of the arrest, he was at the precinct, flanked by 2 assistant attorneys and a civil rights lawyer. He demanded the release of his son and access to the arresting officer's body cam footage. Elise, watching the events unfold from a distance, picked up her phone, not to call the press, but to activate a network. She contacted Marcus, the cybersecurity expert she once deployed alongside. She reached out to Aaron, still operating quietly within the department. She didn't give speeches or post statements. She assembled strategy. Marcus was released that night without charge, but the damage had already been done. The video showed a nervous teen, composed yet visibly shaken, being patted down and cuffed in front of a coffee shop crowd. The arresting officer had ignored clear identification, including the monogrammed graduation sash still hanging from Marcus's back seat. The narrative the department tried to push unraveled fast. Elise began pulling threads. She obtained arrest logs from the past 6 months, cross-checked them with car registration databases and demographic info. Patterns emerged. Young black drivers in nice neighborhoods were stopped at triple the rate of others. She flagged the officers responsible, sent encrypted dossiers to David Williams. Meanwhile, Marcus himself refused to stay quiet. He released a short video from his bedroom, speaking calmly, clearly, directly into the camera. "This is not just about me," he said. "This is about who they think I'm not allowed to be." His words hit harder than outrage. They carried truth without venom, dignity without apology. Elise watched and nodded. He was ready. She met Marcus in person the next day. It wasn't a reunion, it was a passing of a torch. "I can guide," she told him, "but you're the one they'll hear now." He didn't ask for permission. He asked for structure, and Elise provided it. She handed over a document titled Rapid Response Toolkit, something she and Marcus, the tech expert, had built months earlier. Inside, contacts, procedures, public exposure protocols. Marcus read it in silence, then folded it and said, "We won't wait for the system to explain itself." David Williams announced a formal complaint against the department, not just for the arrest, but for what he called a systemic culture of suspicion toward young black excellence. The phrase stuck. Newspapers printed it. Hashtags adopted it. Elise stayed in the background, advising, reviewing statements, ensuring no missteps. She didn't need the spotlight. She had lived through it. Marcus launched a youth task force in response, bringing together students, community leaders, and a few brave officers willing to listen. They met in libraries, community centers, churches. The message was simple. We don't want revenge. We want reform that outlives the headlines. Marcus proposed a public hearing, not just about his arrest, but about every youth stopped under similar pretense. Elise helped prepare the brief. Aaron anonymously provided internal memos showing department reluctance to track race-based stop data, and when the day of the hearing arrived, Marcus stood before the city council and spoke not as a victim, but as a future architect of justice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He detailed fact after fact how the structure enabled assumptions, and how assumptions became protocols. The audience was silent, not with fear, but with recognition. Elise watched from the back, arms crossed, not with pride, but with resolve. After the hearing, the mayor's office reached out. They wanted Marcus to co-chair a civilian oversight board. He agreed, on one condition, that the board have actual power, not symbolic seats. Elise reviewed the charter herself before he signed it, and just like that, what began as another clip of injustice turned into the start of something new. Marcus had learned from the best. He stood still, calm and deliberate, as the officer barked orders and patted him down beside his Tesla. 5 people recorded from different angles, capturing not just the unnecessary force, but the composure of a teenager who knew exactly how to survive the moment. The videos hit social media within minutes. Each showed a different perspective, but together they told the same story. A young black man, visibly non-threatening, being treated as a suspect solely because of what he looked like and what he drove. He didn't resist, he didn't argue, he waited, watching, knowing who he was and who had his back. That back, reinforced by law, media savvy, and lived experience, moved quickly. Police got the alert while checking encrypted messages that monitored key words tied to police misconduct. She immediately contacted David Williams, Marcus's father, already in motion after getting a call from Marcus's former teacher, who had seen the stop from a nearby coffee shop and knew exactly who to call. Elise didn't call reporters. She called strategists, lawyers, civil rights liaisons, people who didn't just yell when wronged. They knew how to write the legal blows. Within hours, a team of legal analysts was reviewing the arrest. The footage, analyzed and time-stamped, was layered with documentation of Marcus's identity, his vehicle ownership, and his speech during the stop. Elise coordinated with Marcus, who was ready with a statement that didn't play to outrage, but to intellect. He spoke on camera. "I didn't do anything wrong, and I won't act like I need forgiveness for being who I am." The public response was sharp. This wasn't an isolated outburst. It was the system caught repeating itself again. Elise reached out to allies across departments. Internal Affairs had already opened a probe. A leaked memo sent to a reporter from someone who had once served under Elise's father revealed that this wasn't the first time that specific officer had profiled young black drivers. But what turned the tide wasn't the data or even the body cam footage. It was the coordination. Elise worked with Marcus's father on drafting a civil motion. Simultaneously, she advised Marcus on how to speak during a press conference without being consumed by the moment. She reminded him that the narrative must stay sharp. This wasn't about his arrest alone. It was a system incapable of learning, now being taught. The press conference the next day wasn't a spectacle. It was a controlled strike. Marcus stood at the podium in a clean black suit, flanked by his parents and Elise standing just behind the media line watching. He spoke with the restraint of someone who had chosen not to burn the system down, but to surgically expose its flaws. This is not justice delayed, this is justice misdiagnosed, and we're here with the cure. The headlines didn't just follow, they echoed. Teen holds police accountable. Prosecutor's son exposes systemic blind spot. Elise reviewed every article, correcting terminology where needed, ensuring facts weren't watered down. She knew too well how stories could get sanitized. That wasn't happening this time. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Elise and Marcus's father drafted a reform proposal, built from Elise's past fieldwork and David's legal clout. The document included provisions for accountability dashboards, public complaint tracking, and an independent audit process. Elise had learned long ago that change wasn't real until it was written into policy and defended in court. The mayor's office reached out, requesting a private meeting. Elise declined to attend but provided notes, a digital trail of suggestions pointing to long-term shifts, not temporary appeasement. She wasn't interested in optics. She was interested in infrastructure. Marcus, for his part, remained focused. He started holding weekly community roundtables, using his voice not as a symbol but as a facilitator. Students attended. So did veterans. So did officers tired of the silence. One such officer, a Latino patrolman who had once served under Rick, apologized privately to Marcus and shared anonymized records of disproportionate traffic stops. Elise helped authenticate the files, then passed them to an investigative journalist she trusted. Within days, a front-page piece titled "Numbers Don't Lie" shattered the myth that bias was unmeasurable. The police chief, under pressure, publicly endorsed the proposal Elise and David had drafted. But that wasn't the win. The win was what came next. For the first time, a local police department requested external training run by civilians. Elise didn't volunteer. She appointed someone better, Marcus. She watched as he stepped into the room weeks later, now flanked by data scientists, activists, and attorneys. Together, they weren't giving lectures, they were rewriting manuals. Elise met with Marcus after his first training session. He was tired but steady. "How do you keep from burning out?" he asked. Elise smiled, thin and knowing. "You build others. Then you're not the fire. They are." Marcus nodded. He understood. He didn't need to be the savior. He just needed to make sure the system never went back to sleep. The loop was broken, not because one person stood up, but because the silence cracked in 5 different places at once. And for the first time in years, Elise allowed herself a moment of stillness, knowing the fight was no longer hers alone. Marcus Williams stood on the City Hall steps, surrounded by reporters, community leaders, and students, as he addressed a crowd that had come not only to support him, but to witness something shift. Just weeks before, he had been another young black teen falsely accused, handcuffed, and humiliated for driving his own car. Today, he wore the same school jacket, the same calm expression, but with something new in his posture, clarity. "My father taught me how to survive," he said, voice firm. "Elise Jefferson taught me how to live right. She didn't just fight for me, she trained me to fight for others. And I stand here not as a victim, but as someone who knows exactly who he is." The crowd erupted in applause, but Elise remained in the background, arms crossed, face unreadable. She hadn't stepped forward for the cameras. She never did. She watched as Marcus owned his moment, not as a symbol, but as a voice, his own. She thought back to the first time she met him, scared and confused, unsure whether he should speak or stay silent. Now here he was, holding court like a seasoned leader. Offers came pouring in after the incident. The city wanted Marcus to join the police oversight board. Several nonprofits asked him to be their ambassador. National programs cited his case in police reform proposals. And through all of it, Elise declined every request that tried to pull her into the spotlight. A journalist had once asked if she would consider running for city council. Her answer was short. "I don't run for office. I train people who'll never need to." That wasn't humility. It was her strategy. Elise believed in building systems where people like Marcus didn't have to rely on heroes to rescue them. Systems where they could walk into any room, any courtroom, any intersection, and be seen as citizens, not suspects. But change had a cost, and Elise knew that well. Every step forward brought new eyes, new threats, and the weight of being a name attached to a movement. People expected her to lead everything, fix everything. She refused. Her mission had always been to create leaders, not followers. Marcus was proof that it was working. Still, that nagging question returned more often now, pressing at her in the quiet moments between strategy calls and late-night research. What happens when I'm not here? Who carries the torch when I fall back? The danger of being the cornerstone was that if you cracked, the structure trembled. Elise had built an entire network, but she worried whether the people within it could withstand the pressure if she ever stepped away. Not because they weren't capable, but because institutions were relentless in how they resisted change. She remembered one of her old instructors saying, "The system doesn't fear your weapons. It fears your discipline." That had stuck with her through deployments and hearings and media attacks, and it echoed now as she listened to Marcus's speech wrapping up. "We can't just react when something breaks. We have to build so strong that they can't even bend us," he said. Elise smiled slightly. That was his voice, not hers, not his father's, his. She turned to leave before the crowd dispersed, slipping away unnoticed like she always did. Back at her apartment, she sat with the worn leather notebook her father once kept. The last entry was dated 2 months before he died. "If I can't change the whole system, let me change one mind before I go." Elise had changed more than one. She flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "What does lasting change require? More than heroes, it needs inheritors." That night she received a message from a local school. A group of students wanted to start a youth legal literacy program. They were calling it Project Jefferson. Elise almost laughed. She hadn't approved the name, hadn't even met the kids. But the point wasn't about her approval, it was about ownership. They had chosen that name because it meant something to them, not because she asked them to. And maybe that's what legacy really was. Not what you built, but what others decided to build because of what you stood for. The next morning, she walked through a community center where Marcus now volunteered. Murals covered the walls, portraits of resilience, captions of lived truth. One of them depicted a young boy with his hands raised, staring down a row of officers. Behind him, painted shadows of Elise, Marcus, and others stood, tall, not shielding him, but standing with him. A caption below read, "They don't define me. I define who I am." She stood there for a while, letting the weight of it settle in. Not pride, not sadness, something in between, something permanent. The world wouldn't remember every name, but it would remember the shift, the break in the pattern. Marcus had become more than a story, he had become a strategy. And Elise? She had become a seed, planted in 100 places at once, growing quietly, growing strong. The system had created Rick Halston, but now the system had to face what Elise Jefferson had created in response, and it wasn't going away. Elise Jefferson never believed in miracles. She believed in frameworks, in drilling habits into bone, in building what would outlive her. So when the national attention faded and the news cycles moved on to the next scandal, Elise began the real work, the kind that didn't go viral. She opened a small center 3 blocks from the courthouse, where she had once stood silent after a boot landed in her stomach. The sign on the front simply read, "Civic Defense Training." No names, no slogans. Inside there were whiteboards, folding chairs, case law printouts taped to the walls, and a projector that barely worked. But it didn't matter. What mattered were the students. At first, there were just 5, 3 high schoolers, a single mother, and a former convict trying to restart his life. By the end of the first month, there were over 40. Elise taught them everything they were never supposed to know: how to legally record a traffic stop, how to request body camera footage, how to identify unconstitutional searches, how to speak when your voice is shaking and the officer is reaching for his belt. She called it self-defense through knowledge. She didn't preach anger or revenge, she drilled precision. You don't have to yell to be powerful, she told them. You have to know the rules better than the people breaking them. While Elise built from the ground, Marcus Williams went digital. His app, Know Your Rights, had already gained traction. But with help from his peers in computer science, he took it to the next level. Now the app activated when triggered by certain phrases. Step out of the car. Am I being detained? Do you have a warrant? It would record video, upload to a secure cloud, and alert a list of emergency contacts, including civil rights attorneys, partnered with the platform. It even tracked repeated complaint patterns on officers, alerting users if they were being stopped by someone with a history of misconduct. Marcus didn't stop there. He started live-streamed Q&A sessions for students in other states, explaining due process in plain language, using real footage from their city's reform battles as case studies. At 17, he had become both witness and watchdog. Meanwhile, Aaron Wallace had stepped fully out of the shadows. After years embedded as a detective in a system he no longer trusted, he accepted the position as Director of Internal Affairs for the new Civilian Oversight Division. But he refused to be a figurehead. Under his leadership, all internal investigations were now co-led by a civilian advisor. Anonymous complaint filing became available via encrypted portal. Officers were required to attend quarterly sessions, where they heard firsthand from people wrongfully detained by their colleagues. Aaron also launched a mentorship program pairing young officers with community activists for joint patrols and listening tours. It wasn't comfortable. That was the point. Every step of this change was designed not just to look different, but to function differently. Elise watched it all unfold from her modest office, balancing lesson plans and court appearances for those she still represented pro bono. She never took credit. In fact, she rarely gave interviews. But she monitored everything, because she knew how fragile reform was when not guarded. One afternoon, after teaching a session on Miranda rights, she sat across from Marcus and Aaron in the back room of the center. The energy was different that day. Less operational, more reflective. "We've built something real," Marcus said, tapping his tablet as data dashboards filled the screen. "Look at these stats. Complaint filings are down. Response times on misconduct are faster. The city's police attrition rate is finally decreasing because good cops aren't leaving in frustration anymore." Aaron nodded. "And IA is no longer the graveyard for inconvenient officers. It's where real accountability starts now." Elise didn't smile. She just said, "Good. Now double everything." They laughed, but they understood. Momentum was one thing. Sustaining it required obsession. The next week, Elise held a round table for teenagers recently cited in school for defiance, a term too often used to criminalize questions. She asked each of them what they thought justice meant. The answers were raw, messy, brilliant. One said, "Justice is when I don't have to memorize where to put my hands when I talk." Another, "It's when my silence isn't assumed to be guilt." Elise didn't correct them. She listened, because this was the generation she was building for. Not to lead one day, but to lead now. That same night, a mother whose son had just completed Elise's training emailed her. The subject line read, "He spoke." In the body of the message, she explained that during a routine traffic stop, her son had calmly asked the officer if he was being detained. The officer paused, then backed off. No handcuffs, no citations, no escalation. Just a conversation. "It's the first time he came home without fear in his eyes," the email. Elise read it twice, closed her laptop, and stared out her office window. No headlines, no cameras, just a quiet win, one of many. Change, she knew, didn't roar forever. Sometimes it whispered through lives that had learned how to survive differently. She'd built the curriculum. Marcus had built the tech. Aaron had built the system. Now the question wasn't if it would grow. It was whether the roots were deep enough to survive the next storm. Elise stood quietly before the headstone, the wind brushing past her coat as if trying to carry her father's memory back into the world. The grave was simple, weathered, engraved with the name Jeremiah Jefferson and the words, "He served truth, even when it didn't serve him." It had been years since she last stood here. Not out of neglect, but because she had spent every day trying to finish what he started. Now, with the city changed, reforms underway, and her own name etched into headlines and lawsuits alike, she had finally come to speak not as a soldier, not as a witness, but as a daughter. She had no speech prepared, no flowers in hand. She whispered something only the wind could carry. "You were right. It had to be earned, not given." As she turned to leave, a voice stopped her. "Are you the lady who got kicked on TV?" She looked down and saw a boy, no older than 9, standing beside a bicycle far too big for him. His backpack was half-zipped and his sneakers had seen better days, but his eyes were bright, curious, unafraid. Elise paused, then crouched to meet him at eye level. "Yeah," she said softly. "That was me." The boy studied her with the seriousness only children could summon. "My mom showed me," he said. "She said you didn't hit back. She said you made them listen without yelling." Elise gave a small nod. "Sometimes you don't win by being louder, you win by being clearer." The boy considered that, then asked, "So, did you win?" She thought for a moment. "I didn't lose." He smiled like that was better than winning. "I want to be like you," he said. "I want to wear the uniform and help people, but not the scary way, the real way." She felt something catch in her throat. "Then you already know more than most people wearing a badge." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small notebook. It was tattered, filled with scribbles and drawings. "I write down stuff I want to remember. Can I write your name?" "Only if you promise to write your own one day," she replied. The boy nodded solemnly and flipped to a clean page. "ELISE he wrote slowly, sounding out each letter. Then he tucked the notebook away like it held state secrets. "I gotta go," he said, glancing toward the street. "If I'm late for school again, they make me sit in the hallway." "Stay out of hallways," Elise said with a small grin. "Sit in the room. Ask the hard questions. Even if the teacher gets mad? Especially then." He climbed onto his bike, legs barely long enough to pedal, and rode off without another word. Elise watched him disappear down the hill, a streak of blue and silver in the morning light, and she felt something settle in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Not the kind that came from legislation or press conferences, the kind that came from a child remembering your name because it meant something. As she walked back to her car, she thought of the hundreds of people who had reached out over the months. Some wanted advice, others wanted mentorship, a few just wanted to say thank you. But none of them mattered more than that one boy, because he hadn't seen her as a victim. He'd seen her as a reason. The streets of Birmingham still held scars, and Elise knew the system could never be fully trusted to heal itself. But healing didn't always come from institutions. It came from inheritance, the kind passed not through blood, but through bravery. Back in the city, Marcus was preparing another community session. Aaron was finalizing a draft for a national oversight model. Students were learning law the way others learned arithmetic, and in a small notebook in a backpack bouncing down a sidewalk, Elise Jefferson's name sat underlined in pencil. Not because she fought with fists, because she fought with purpose. Not because she shouted, but because she spoke when silence was expected. And somewhere in the heart of a child who knew her story, the next battle for justice had already begun to form. Not out of rage, but readiness. Elise Jefferson left Birmingham at sunrise. No press conference, no farewell speech, just a handwritten letter left on the desk of the Community Oversight Board chair, attached to a USB drive labeled Reform Package V3. She had done what she came to do, not to expose one man, not even to bring down one network, but to make the system see itself. The reforms she fought for had teeth now: independent citizen-led review panels with full access to case files, mandatory bias training every quarter, automatic public release of body cam footage after every high-risk stop, and whistleblower protections for officers like Aaron Wallace who dared to speak up. Elise didn't stick around to watch the changes take root. She didn't need to. She had seen enough systems try to save face. This time she wanted the work to stand without her name propping it up. In her absence, something strange happened. Her story became curriculum. First, a criminal justice course in New York State added a unit titled The Jefferson Doctrine. Then a community college in Illinois used her courtroom confrontation as a case study in modern policing ethics. Within a year, her timeline, from courthouse assault to system-wide reform, was embedded in law school modules, journalism ethics workshops, and leadership development programs in at least 17 states. They studied her not as a martyr or an icon, but as a strategist. Her restraint, her discipline, her refusal to let rage become the enemy of results, these were not just praised, they were dissected. Meanwhile, Elise settled in a small coastal town where no one knew her name. She took long walks. She taught self-defense once a week at the local rec center. Sometimes she gave talks under an alias to women preparing for court appearances or job interviews post-incarceration. She never introduced herself as the woman from the clip. She wanted them to hear her words without the filter of fame. Every so often, an email from Marcus or Aaron would land in her inbox. An update, a thank you, a snapshot of a protest sign quoting her line, "The law is not just a badge, it's a mirror." She always smiled at those, then archived them without reply. The work was theirs now. Back in Birmingham, the Jefferson reforms became a benchmark for other cities. Baltimore adapted the model, then St. Louis, then Oakland. Soon, mayors were convening to compare implementation strategies, and Elise's timeline, day by day, move by move, was projected in city halls. Even federal oversight committees began citing her testimony in hearings. and still she stayed away. She didn't crave the spotlight, she distrusted it. The moment people started building statues, they stopped building systems. One fall afternoon, Elise received a thick envelope postmarked from Georgia. Inside was a program from a high school graduation. On the back page was a photo of a smiling black teenager in a police cadet uniform. The caption read, "I joined because of her, not to protect the law, to protect the people the law forgets." No name, no return address, just a memory passed forward like a torch. She folded the program gently and placed it in her father's old field journal, now worn with notes and corner folds. She whispered his name and let the quiet settle in the room. She hadn't changed the country, but she had changed what the country tolerated. That mattered, because now, when someone got pulled over unjustly, 5 different bystanders pulled out phones. When an officer filed a suspicious report, 3 different reviewers checked the footage. And when someone said, "That's just how the system works," more people replied, "It doesn't have to." That was her legacy. Not a speech, not a headline, but a shift, a reprogramming, a refusal. She walked the beach every morning. She read Supreme Court rulings with her coffee. She never wore her uniform again. But her steps had carved something permanent in the dirt behind her, a path others were already following. And every time she saw a young woman raise her hand at a town hall, every time she read about a teenager challenging their school's policing policies, she knew the road wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to all of them. The Jefferson Framework, once a localized reform initiative, had evolved into a national model for systemic change. Its principles, community oversight, transparent accountability, and proactive legal education, were adopted by over 12 states, each tailoring the framework to address their unique challenges while preserving its core ethos. Law enforcement agencies in these states reported improved community relations, decreased incidents of misconduct, and enhanced trust between officers and the communities they served. The success of these implementations caught the attention of federal authorities. The Department of Justice, recognizing the framework's efficacy, included it in their annual report as a recommended model for nationwide policing reforms. This endorsement not only validated the framework's effectiveness, but also encouraged other jurisdictions to consider its adoption. Training programs based on the Jefferson Framework were developed, providing law enforcement officers with tools to engage communities constructively and uphold justice impartially. Educational institutions incorporated the framework into their curricula, ensuring that future legal professionals understood the importance of equitable law enforcement practices. The ripple effect of Elise Jefferson's work continued to spread, influencing policies and practices across the country. Her commitment to justice and her innovative approach to reform had laid the groundwork for a more equitable and accountable legal system. As communities embraced the principles of the Jefferson Framework, a new standard for justice emerged, one rooted in transparency, accountability, and mutual respect. The path Elise had forged became a guiding light for those committed to transforming the justice system from within. Her legacy lived on, not just in policy changes, but in the renewed hope of communities striving for a fair and just society. The Jefferson Framework stood as a testament to the power of determined individuals to effect meaningful change, inspiring a generation to continue the pursuit of justice. As the framework's influence grew, it became clear that Elise's vision had transcended her own efforts, embedding itself into the fabric of a nation seeking to redefine justice. The journey she had begun was now carried forward by countless others, each step reinforcing the foundation she had laid. The Jefferson Framework was no longer just a set of policies, it was a movement, a symbol of what could be achieved when courage met conviction in the fight for justice. The impact of Elise's work resonated in courtrooms, classrooms, and communities, a lasting reminder that true reform is possible when driven by unwavering dedication to equity and fairness. Her story became a beacon for those who believed in the transformative power of justice, illuminating the path toward a more just and inclusive society. As the framework continued to shape the future of law enforcement and legal education, Elise's influence remained a guiding force, inspiring ongoing efforts to build a system that serves and protects all members of society equally. The Jefferson Framework's integration into national discourse marked a significant shift in how justice was conceptualized and implemented, reflecting a collective commitment to uphold the principles Elise had championed. Her legacy, etched into the policies and practices of a reformed justice system, stood as a powerful testament to the enduring impact of visionary leadership and the relentless pursuit of justice. The framework's continued success underscored the importance of community involvement, transparency, and accountability in fostering trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Elise's work had not only transformed policies, but had also reshaped the cultural landscape of justice, promoting a more empathetic and inclusive approach to law enforcement. As the Jefferson Framework became a cornerstone of modern policing, it served as a reminder that meaningful change is achievable through collaboration, education, and unwavering commitment to justice. The framework's widespread adoption signaled a new era in law enforcement, one where the voices of the community were integral to shaping policies and practices. Elise's vision had catalyzed a movement that redefined the relationship between law enforcement and the communities they serve, fostering a culture of mutual respect and shared responsibility. The Jefferson Framework's principles continued to guide reforms, ensuring that justice was not only administered but also perceived as fair and impartial by all. As the framework's influence expanded, it became a model for other nations seeking to reform their own justice systems, demonstrating the universal applicability of its core tenets. Elise's work had transcended borders, inspiring a global conversation about the importance of equitable and community-centered approaches to justice. The Jefferson Framework's success served as a blueprint for systemic change, proving that with determination and collaboration, it is possible to build a justice system that truly serves all people. Elise's legacy lived on through the continued evolution and adaptation of the framework. As new challenges emerged and communities worked together to address them, her unwavering commitment to justice had sparked a movement that would continue to grow and adapt, ensuring that the principles she had fought for remained at the heart of legal reforms for generations to come. The Jefferson Framework's enduring relevance highlighted the necessity of continual reflection and adaptation in the pursuit of justice, encouraging ongoing dialogue and innovation within the legal community. Elise's contributions had laid the foundation for a dynamic and responsive justice system, one that could evolve to meet the changing needs of society while staying true to its core values. As the framework continued to influence policy and practice, it served as a testament to the power of visionary leadership and the impact of dedicated advocacy in shaping a more just and equitable world. The Jefferson Framework's integration into the fabric of the justice system ensured that Elise's legacy would endure, guiding future generations in their efforts to uphold the principles of fairness, accountability, and community engagement. Her work had not only transformed the justice system, but had also inspired a collective commitment to building a society where justice is accessible and equitable for all. The Jefferson Framework stood as a lasting symbol of what can be achieved when individuals come together to challenge the status quo and work towards a common goal of justice and equality. Elise's story continued to inspire, reminding us that the pursuit of justice is an ongoing journey, one that requires courage, resilience, and an unwavering belief in the power of change. As the Jefferson Framework continued to shape the future of justice, it carried forward the spirit of Elise's work, ensuring that her vision of a fair and inclusive society remained alive and influential. The framework's ongoing success demonstrated that meaningful reform is possible when driven by a clear vision, collaborative effort, and a steadfast commitment to the principles of justice. Elise's legacy, embodied in the Jefferson Framework, served as a guiding light for all those dedicated to creating a more just and equitable world. Elise walked into the modest community center on the corner of Auburn Avenue and Hilliard Street in Atlanta. The walls were lined with flyers for literacy workshops, youth mentorship programs, and voter registration drives. No one turned their head when she passed. No one pointed. No one whispered. She was just another woman in a plain black windbreaker, a notebook tucked under her arm, eyes observant but unassuming. That was the point. The circle of chairs in the center of the room filled with young adults, some fresh out of school, some who had already seen more than their share of hardship. They introduced themselves not by credentials, but by causes. Jasmine, 22, a paralegal who had been profiled twice last year. Malik, 28, a former inmate who now worked in re-entry services. Deshaun, 19, the youngest in the room, who had started recording traffic stops in his neighborhood after his brother was detained for fitting a description. Elise sat silently as they spoke, taking notes, her eyes moving slowly from one face to the next. At no point did she mention her name. It wasn't about her. It was never about her. She was there to listen, to observe what the next chapter looked like. When it was her turn to speak, she stood up slowly, unfolded a single sheet of paper from her notebook, and said, "What you build today doesn't have to end with you. If it does, it was just a reaction. If it grows beyond your reach, then it's a movement. Your job is not to be recognized. Your job is to make what you know contagious." She folded the paper again, set it on the empty chair beside her, and sat back down. No one applauded. They didn't need to. The silence that followed was heavier than clapping. The session moved on. They dissected body cam footage. They analyzed legal loopholes. They discussed how to teach these things in barbershops, churches, corner stores, places where trust lived. By the time the workshop ended, Elise was gone. Her name was never mentioned. But on the board, someone had written 3 words underlined in red: "Train the trainers." It became their motto. Over the next 6 months, that same circle spawned others. In Savannah, in Raleigh, in New Orleans. They didn't call themselves anything official. There were no shirts or slogans, just handwritten pamphlets, QR codes leading to encrypted toolkits, and whispers passed from mentor to mentee. Elise never appeared in their meetings again, but sometimes they'd find books donated anonymously, pocket constitutions, case law summaries, annotated police conduct reports, always with a post-it inside, "Keep going." In one meeting, Malik asked Jasmine if she'd ever met the woman who started it all. Jasmine shook her head. She said, "She's just a relay runner," she replied. "Pass the torch and disappear." No one questioned it. No one idolized her, and that was the legacy. The system they were working against had faces and names and titles, press releases and platforms. But the system they were building, it had roots. And roots don't need applause. They just need soil. Years later, when a group of middle school students from Chicago wrote essays on modern heroes, a surprising number of them mentioned Elise Jefferson. They didn't all spell her name right. Some called her a lawyer. Others thought she had been a judge or a senator. One simply wrote, "She was the lady who stood up when everybody else bowed." The essays were published in a small journal. Elise never saw them. She was already in another city, sitting quietly in the back of another room, listening to another generation plant seeds she would never live to see bloom. One day in D.C., a first-year law student named Adriana flipped open her digital syllabus and saw the title "The Jefferson Doctrine" listed under Week 9. The reading was about transparency in law enforcement reform and decentralized civic education. The professor mentioned Elise's name only once in passing. Adriana underlined the phrase, "decentralized accountability structures." She didn't know Elise had once bled for that line to exist. She didn't need to. At a protest outside the courthouse in Phoenix, a young woman held a sign that read, "Don't wait for leaders. Become impossible to ignore." She didn't know those were Elise's words, spoken in a basement meeting in Mobile 4 years prior. She didn't have to. The words had a life of their own now. At a legal conference in Boston, an older man in a tailored gray suit gave a keynote on systemic reform. He quoted a phrase from an unnamed community activist that brought the room to its feet. True change happens when the ones you trained don't need to remember your name. He paused, looking around the room. And we're lucky, he said, that she trained more than we'll ever know. In the back, Elise sipped her coffee unnoticed. Just another face in the crowd, just another witness to something taking root. And that, she knew, was the win. She had become irrelevant. The work hadn't. The movement moved without her. And that was the end. But also the beginning. In a world where silence is often safer than truth, Elise Jefferson chose to speak, to act, and then to step aside. Her story wasn't about becoming a symbol. It was about breaking the cycle and building something that didn't depend on her presence. From a courtroom floor to encrypted classrooms across the country, her legacy became a quiet revolution fueled not by fame, but by purpose. And now the question is no longer whether justice can exist, it's who will carry it next. So, what would you have done in Elise's position? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Because some stories aren't just meant to be told, they're meant to be passed on.